No, I like it. Make the meeting.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at the Lara Robinson Booksellers. Thank you. People don't normally cheer me, so I appreciate it. On behalf of the store, we're so thrilled to see you here tonight. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, in the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. I pledge to not take up too much of your time. I just have a few very quick introductory notes because we are here, of course, to celebrate the launch of Messy Ethics in Human Rights work published by the UBC Press. We have a large raft of co-editors here to speak, so I'll just go over a few very quick procedural notes before calling up the first person. There will be a series of brief presentations from the podium, followed by a conversation to my left. There will also be the opportunity for you people to ask questions. Now, just to ensure your questions are audible to those watching at home, we have set up a stationary microphone right over here. So if you do have a question, please feel free to approach it. And then when the time comes for questions, you will be acknowledged. We'll be winding down just at around 8 o'clock or so, or just shortly thereafter, following which there will be an informal signing here in the space. And I'll let you know a little bit more about that at the end of the event. But for now, it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's first speaker, Shayna Plaut. Her work sits at the intersection of academia, journalism, and advocacy. She is interested in how people represent themselves in their own media, with a particular interest in peoples who do not fit neatly within the traditional notions of the nation state. Please join me in welcoming Shayna Plaut.
It is so amazing to be here with friends and family, virtual and physical. Thank you. We are very grateful. At the center of this book is that of relationships. The relationships that we have had together as editors, the relationships that we have in the land that we're on, the land that hopefully we are giving more to and contributing to here in Treaty 1 and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and the relationships that we have professionally as well. Most especially, I want to thank the Center for Human Rights Research, the unseen and tireless support of Pauline Tennant, especially. Thank you. Some of us would not physically be here, without her. We would also not be able to see some of the work here. The relationships, even with Dr. Lori Wilkinson, who originally introduced myself to Christina, and then helped start a lot of these conversations that were going on. So thank you, and without further ado, in order to contextualize this book, the very messiness and beauty of it, I would like to introduce Dr. Christina Clark-Kazak from Ottawa.
Thank you very much. So the joy and the challenge of having 5 co-editors is you're often voluntold to do things. So I have the very difficult task of trying to summarize the book. And so the honor of being a co-editor is not following the instructions of your fellow co-editor. And so I'm not going to try to summarize the book. What I'm going to tell you is that it emerged out of a series of conversations, and we decided that we wanted to continue those conversations today. Because at the heart of the book is the idea that ethics is messy, but ethics is also a continuous process. Often when we think about ethics, like ethics boards or code of ethics, there's a very sort of prescriptive approach where things are either right or wrong. And what we're trying to do in the book is to challenge that notion. And it's done through a very unique style because each chapter is centered around a dilemma or a questioning. And each author has very courageously talked about what didn't go well, what they would do differently next time, but where they still actually have questions. And so we wanted tonight to be about asking some of those questions and continuing some of the answers. And I also was told by Shayna to mention that the book is available for purchase today, but it also is available online free of charge through open access. And from the very beginning, it was really important to us that the book be available widely, because our contributors come not only from academia, but also from journalism, from humanitarian work, from the public service, from many other walks of life. And so we wanted to make it as accessible as possible. And Maritza and I were able to secure a grant from the University of Ottawa to make that possible. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Neil Bilotta to facilitate the discussion. Neil is a professor at the University of North Carolina.
Thank you, Christina. Hey, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. So glad you're here. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's really great to be up here. So this book, as sort of Christina's been talking about, is just so much, right? There's so much about ethics. What are ethics? Who gets to decide what ethics are? How to engage with ethics? And so we just wanted to have a conversation with you all and each other tonight about ethics. And some of our questions are drawn directly from the conclusion of the conclusion chapter of the book. And that's just a place to start a discussion. Things have changed. I flew over here. I was telling my colleagues I flew here yesterday, and on the airplane I was reading the conclusion and was cringing at some of the answers that I wrote, just how things change, you know, because we started this conversation in 2019, October 2019, and there's been life, there's been death, there's been a pandemic, there's been all sorts of things that have influenced our unique individual identities, but also socio-politically as well. So I want us to have this conversation and engage in some of this. And then we'll also get you all involved too, as much as you'd like to be. So again, thank you for being here. And I think the first question that we want to explore is how do you do ethics in different contexts, right? Whether that's sort of activism, teaching, organizing, mentoring, research, how do you embrace ethics and ethical stance? And so why don't we start with Nick?
Hi, everyone. How do I embrace ethics? I am a human rights educator and a student. And so ethics is sort of something that permeates the entirety of what I do. I'm trusted to teach kids as young as 4 or 5 years old about human rights, up to the university level through work. And I think for me, it started at a place of how do I do this responsibly and how do I do as little harm as I can while talking about these very difficult concepts. I also started teaching about these things when I was 23, and retrospectively, I don't know that I was as well equipped as I would have liked to teach about these very intense sorts of questions. And one of the things I speak to my groups is that broadly in human rights, the titanic questions are often the easiest. Should people face discrimination? No, probably not. I think we can all sort of get on board with that, right? Easy question. Hard solution, but easy question. But as you get to sort of more liminal spaces there and nuanced or opinion-driven questions or culturally driven questions, then the conversation gets a lot harder because we all feel strongly and so does everyone else. And how do you navigate those things? And often behaving ethically and engaging with those systems as they change, as they evolve, is one of the ways to do that. As you said, some of the answers will change as you answer the same question over and over again. Reading through my own chapter, oh yeah, no, I am not an editor, I'm a contributor. Reading through my own chapter, there are things in there that I see and I go, oh, I don't know if that was the right take, I would maybe approach that a little bit differently. So I think engaging with it as a thing that evolves and engaging with it as a thing that exists and lives embedded in relationships and humanity and personhood is my answer to that question.
Excellent. What a deep and profound and just important response. I appreciate your authenticity with that. I'd also like to hear Lara's response to this.
Would you know? It's a good question. I think for me, ethics is it's a part of living. It's a part of life, right? It's not a separate thing for me to consider. It is something that I have also been teaching and learning about grave human rights abuses for decades. And it's something that in those contexts, people lack. People don't uphold, people transgress. And so for myself, whether it's teaching, whether it's learning, whether it's any relationship that I have, I really try to uphold. I mean, you could think about it as ethics, you could think about it as respect, reciprocity, as care. But for me, it's not a separate thing. It's really fundamental to how I try to live my life. Doesn't mean it's easy or straightforward or prescriptive, but I think for me, it's really always asking the question of, you know, within a given situation, what is it to be respectful and to have care and reciprocity? And to me, that is kind of the ethical stance. The having, you know, just being able to embrace it or trying to embrace it in those teachings.
Yeah, I think I can totally relate to sort of this notion of embodying ethics and reciprocity and respect, and what do these terms actually mean and how do they change according to culture and context is really important as well. I think I heard you saying that and being reflexive about that.
Yeah, I'm just always learning, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Maritza.
I think for me, it's about responsibility, and it's responsibility towards others, responsibility towards the land, towards humanity, and it's therefore always a question, because you cannot be responsible to everything and everything at the same time. So you always have to make choices, and you always have to prioritize. And on what basis do you prioritize, and when do you prioritize here or there? That's the ongoing work, and that's the cringing moments for me, that it's like, oh, then I made the wrong decision, right? But it's also because you saw the consequences, or because you reflected about what happened. But it is almost a duty, but it's also a duty that it's there's reciprocity in that duty also, right? And so I guess that's where I'll stop.
Shayna, do you want to? Thank you, Maritza.
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer the question by what was driving me in terms of this book, which was actually learning from my students, learning from people with whom I was entrusted to teach, but who are always the best teachers. And you know, 20 years of working with folks who are either going to be going in the field to do human rights internships, who are going to be going in the field to do co-ops, who are working on human rights, academic work, projects, etc., who are the fear that they had in going out, the questions that they had in coming back. The doing of ethics was actually recognizing, hold on, there's a pattern to this. There's a pattern to the discomfort. There's a pattern to really confronting and recognizing positionality and power and being uneasy in that. And so therefore, we may also have a responsibility to be transparent in our own vulnerability and transparent in our own mistakes, and transparent in how we have wrestled as well. And that to me is an example of doing ethics, which means that vulnerability, that public vulnerability, and the invitation for others to contribute to that as well. And to then put it in print, to have that finiteness, even though we know it's not.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's just round it out with Christina here.
I don't know, I mean, I think that the heart of this question is really the context, right? And I think that there's often an assumption of universality, particularly in like codes of ethics. And what I think this really shows to us is that it really depends on, because it's about relationships, it depends on where those relationships are in time and space. And so I think that what's really interesting about the book is that you have such a broad range of context, both in terms of the thematic context, but also the geographic places. So, a chapter on from a humanitarian aid worker in Greece, and then Lara's chapter that kind of looks at Uganda, but also then looks at the way in which that story from Uganda was viewed from a kind of Canadian academic lens. And so I think that really it's about trying to understand the relationships in place, which means that you have to constantly adapt and you have to constantly be reflexive, which is not what is sort of taught in terms of these like universal codes.
Wow, those are some really, really profound answers. Thank you, Christina. And I know nobody asked me, but I'll share. No, just to really wrap this question up. Something that I sort of struggle with, and I think it's based upon my identities, is, as a white cis man doing work in global contexts, whatever that actually means. But this notion of messy ethics and making mistakes, I think something that really struck to me was what you said, Nick, around minimizing harm. And when do my mistakes become really problematic? And how do I sort of notice that, oh, it's important for me because I'll reflect on that and do better next time, but I really just did something that was quite problematic and harmful. So that's something that I sit with quite a bit. So I want to sort of turn now to, sorry.
Can I add something?
Please, of course.
So like you're talking about minimizing harm and thinking about that, and I think that's a big part of it, right? Like doing human rights work, you're trying to do some good, right? To a sense, but then many people think they're doing good in the world, right? And then to not want to cause violence in your work, which often happens, I think, in human rights work and human rights context. So to me, that's also like really important to reflect in a field where most people, especially students, like they want to do good, right? And then if you don't have the reflection and transparency and accountability, then it becomes just an unexamined violence as well.
No, thank you for, that's, yeah.
Is this what your editorial?
We say it was a conversation. So yeah, and I think that the good is also in regards to whom are we doing good for, and with, and when, and what is the scope, right? And sometimes we're focusing on the micro, and all this harm is being results from that focus, and sometimes we're too broad, right? So it's also a matter of time, place, but also scope. As a little bit what I was saying before in terms of the relationships, right? Am I focusing on the immediate relationship, or am I focusing on the broader social networks and connection between people and groups of people? And so it's all these questions, and again, for me, no answers.
And one thing, just in terms of with the book itself and what we can see, there's a chapter written by Claudine Chevrier. Hi, Claudine. Focusing on what does it mean to do work with a community of which you are not a part. But then we also have chapters in the book Whereas what does it mean to do work with communities of which you are a part, right? And you're holding ethics and accountability in both spaces, but it's different. And really recognizing that and what that means and to whom you are accountable, and do you get to go home, right? Or are you working with and for and on your home, and that part as well.
Yeah, I think just to sort of transition into the next question, that these notions of how does home influence what constitutes good or bad or harm or violence, right? And whose reality, and who gets to claim that was actually harmful according to me, and I get to name that because that was my reality. So speaking of that, when we do make mistakes, when we are engaged in this work, emotions come up. And so what role do sort of emotions play in your work, in your human rights work? I mean, right, as should we have emotions? Should we be emotional? What does that mean, and who gets to decide? Maritza.
I wasn't supposed to do it.
Oh, you weren't supposed to, but we'd love to hear from you.
Look at you, where's the social worker?
Okay, so okay, so as you can see, I wasn't ready for this one.
How does it make you feel?
Emotional. So for me, emotions, I've always distanced myself from emotions, and then I started to say, well, no, we need to take into account emotions, and therefore I'm going to analyze the emotion, or the emotion is going to become a source of like a hint, something's going on here. Now brain, go in and understand what's going on, right? But now I'm trying to head into emotion as the processing of it, as the ethical moment in itself, and as of not a way to bring reason in, but on the contrary, keep reason at bay and engage emotionally with whatever the situation is, and whatever, and then you brought up vulnerability, right? And there's that, but there's also the negotiation of whose emotion counts more, and is it my emotion that has to come forward, or am I receptive of other people's emotion? And that will generate emotions in me. But that's sort of working through it at a different level. And my emotion IQ is below 0, okay? So it's an ongoing process that it's a challenge precisely, but I think I'm learning to sort of try to negotiate or navigate through that. That's why I didn't want to answer this question.
Thank you, very rich answer. Nick?
Sure. To me, emotions are a fundamental part of the work, inextricable in many ways. Again, I go back to my job where I came to these thoughts in this world through the lens of teaching kids. And as I'm sure most people in this room know, when you're in that position, part of engaging in teaching kids is dealing with the emotional complexities that come with existing in the world and growing up and understanding things. And because I'm often teaching them very difficult or challenging material, that question is more complicated still. But I also, when teaching adults, often run into the people who will say stuff like, well, you're being illogical or irrational or whatever the case may be. And I mean, logic and rationality are culturally constructed and bounded concepts right up top, so we can toss them out. But I think more fundamentally for me, if I didn't have emotions and didn't allow myself to feel them, I wouldn't care about committing harm. it wouldn't matter, right? I wouldn't be invested in my community and the communities that I'm trying to support and be allied to. But also the whole project of human rights is sort of predicated on emotions. Human beings are emotional entities by definition. If we removed our emotions, we'd be automata, and we wouldn't need human rights because we wouldn't care about violations and abuses. It's fundamentals of the whole project, and to remove it, for me, removes essential humanity. And that includes myself. I don't like thinking about my mistakes and causing harm, but I have to, because that's the only way I get better.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks so much. It's a really, really important response. Shane, yeah, Christina, please.
I just wanted to pick up on what Nick said about care and caring, because I've been thinking a lot about care ethics, which originally I sort of shied away from because I thought it was very sort of patronizing. And in fact, a lot of the original work was from sort of white feminists and was problematic. But one of the elements of care ethics is emotions. And if you think about care as a verb, to care about something means that you're going to be moved by it. You're going to have some kind of emotional attachment to it. And that is at the heart of human rights. But I also think, as Maritza said, it's easy to center oneself and one's cares when sometimes actually that's not what is the most important. So I think there's a bit of a fine balance between that. And I would also say, by thinking about care ethics and emotions, it also brings into the whole notion of emotional labor. Like, who is being asked to tell their story? Who is being asked to be the victim, quote unquote? What is that work doing? And what are the harms that are being perpetuated by having people who have to constantly play those roles? And you know, how can we think about doing things in a better way that is more ethical and centers those emotions in a different kind of way.
I don't think of myself as I'm gonna answer this a different way. I used to be very goth. I used to like to wear lots of black and well, I guess that's I have 13 earrings, you know, there's black arms and cat eye things happening, you know. But I was always this goth with hope. So I was like the non-misanthropic goth. I was like the goth who would like bring the friends to the party. And you're like, Shayna, what does this have to do with emotions and human rights? But we're getting somewhere. And what I always, I used to work at a torture treatment center. And I used to work at a refugee shelter. And I, because of language skills, would sometimes have to be an impromptu interpreter for people who had really went through grave human rights abuses in front of their mother-in-laws. And I would have to just interpret it right on the spot. I have seen gross human rights violations. And what keeps me going and is the fact that I work on human rights. I do not work on human rights violations. I want to focus on and see what would it look like if we could live in a world in which human rights are respected. What would that world be? What do we need in order to have that world? What are the barriers and the boundaries and the obstacles to having that world? Because I firmly hold on to the fact that that world is possible. And so I am deeply committed to the emotion of hope, not naivete, and not hope as in this idealism of I'm going to somehow do it, but hope as if, and in terms of possibilities. And if I don't have that hope, and sometimes I don't, I look to others, I look to people who have experienced grave human rights violations and are here today. And I look to them and I'm like, okay, like, just because it's the way it was doesn't mean it's the way it has to be. There are other ways of doing it, and we have living examples of this. And we have, and I think that is the emotion that I commit to holding on to, because otherwise it's so much despair.
really landed with me, especially right now. I just see your passion, Shayna. I'm glad others can as well feel that. I'm imagining, but I think I struggle with hope quite a bit, just based on the violence currently, historically, especially coming from the US. So thank you. I really needed that, and I could feel it land in my body. I think another sort of transition into the next question around hope, or how do we work with others? How do we hold that hope when we work with others who are in such disagreement with us fundamentally? And so I guess I want to just sort of explore what are some of the benefits of working or engaging with people who have different values than you. How do you do that? Lara?
Okay, yeah, okay. How do we do it, or why should we do it? I'll just start with how, I'll say how I do it. I think I'm just a curious person, first of all, I am someone who is interested in other people, and I know people come to their positions through their own life histories, right, and their own experiences, and I don't know what those are. And so, and they're obviously different than mine because we have very opposing views, for example. So for me, I think there's that curiosity of trying to understand how they come to their point. You know, I don't think even people who I definitely don't agree with or don't condone, they still come to that position through a series of life experiences. And so I'm curious about what that is and to have a conversation about that. And so I would to me, those are actually some of the best conversations you can have that foster understanding, because how else, where else, for me, that hope comes in conversation a lot, and to try to understand across those different values.
Thank you, Lara.
For me, I think I will tend not to want to engage in conversation. Conversation for me implies being willing to change your mind, not only being willing to change somebody else's mind. And there are certain things that I will not change my mind. They're basic for me. And therefore I cannot engage. It's not an honest conversation if I'm only trying to tear down there, because at the same time, unless it's someone who's really questioning, and then I can engage, but someone who has an opposite view of the world, then they are also holding to that view and they're not willing to change it, right? And when those views are of white supremacy, homophobia, things that dehumanize me, then it's not an even conversation, because it is about me advocating for my humanity. So I will do that when it is not about, when the values that are being against are not who I am. And I'm hoping that someone like the white cis straight guy will then engage with the homophobic white supremacist, right? And then I'll take on the other one. Right? So let's split that. That's my take.
Does it always have to be a matter of changing perspectives to engage in a conversation? I'm just curious.
That's why I engage in conversations. I want to win.
I just have a fundamental, different approach. But really interesting.
I love talking and working with people whose ideas and values are different than my own. I really do. And I think part of it is that curiosity. I really want to understand, how did you come to that position? Like, I know that there's a logic there, and I don't get it. And one of the most fascinating conversations I ever had as a like queer Jew was with a neo-Nazi. And man, that was fascinating. But it was 2.5 hours of fascinating. But hearing this, I wrote, but I have so much more patience with people who are distant from me. I can have those conversations with people for whom I know I can walk away. I wish I had that patience with my own family. And I know you're watching, guys. Hi, Mama. You know, I wish I had that patience with my own family, or with people whom I would see every day, and I don't. And I want to work on that, actually.
It depends for me a lot on context. I also struggle with family members and folks I'm close with. I don't enjoy those conversations, frankly. But for a long time, it was my job to talk with people who have opposing views with me. And those can be more interesting and fruitful in different ways, though there is also the element for me of being a white person and having a lot of racialized colleagues who I don't want them to feel forced into those positions, and I'm able to do that emotional labor a little bit more easily or readily. But I think for me, the thing that I've learned by engaging with people like that is the importance of allowing myself to be surprised by them. I have a lot of stories. I have one in particular of someone who was discussing colonial genocide in Canada with me and did not have views on it that I would, in my personal life, even condone discussing, but because of the context I was in, we chatted about, and I watched over the course of an hour as he gained more and more new information that his views crumbled. And he, at one point, looked at me and said, "Oh no, everything I've believed is super racist. What should I believe now?" And I was paid $16 an hour at the time. It was much above my pay grade. "You should believe that therapists exist." That's what I said. You know, I've had those, but I've also had conversations with people who are just staunchly like hard no matter what I do or what I say. And that didn't teach me a ton about them necessarily, but it taught me about me and dealing with the disappointment of not being able to get my point across in a way that I felt valid, understanding that there are other points of view in the world that I will never probably understand or agree with, but I have to make peace with the fact that those people exist. But it also often teaches me about the ways that systems and structures fail. I don't think anyone grows up with the desire to dehumanize other people. And I think that there's a failure of public education or some structure or system in that person's life. Maybe they didn't get the kind of social supports they need. I don't know. The list is 1 million pages long, but there has been a failure somewhere. And as an educator, if I can learn from that conversation what that failure may have been and seek to prevent or minimize that failure reoccurring in my own practice, then I think that is also of value. And whether that person wants to or not, they have inadvertently contributed to human rights in some capacity, even through opposition.
Thanks, Nick. Christina, what do you think about this?
That's a really hard act to follow, I must say. So I am a person who by nature tries to avoid conflict. And so I also, especially when it's a personal issue, I think sometimes it's a self-care mechanism where you have to draw a boundary and just be like, we agree to disagree on this issue. But I think as an instructor or a teacher at the university, similar to your situations, I think it really opens your eyes to the fact that there are many different views and that it's important for those views. People need to feel like they're being listened to. So, and I think it's really easy to dehumanize people with whom we disagree. And so I think that has helped me is to think, okay, this is a human being. There are reasons why they hold these views. Let's try to sort of dig under that. I do find it very challenging in a classroom though, because I teach in complex studies in human rights, to set parameters so that it's a safe space, but also make sure people feel like they're not just being shut down as soon as people don't agree with something. So I think that's a really fine balance. And I think it's something that I'm still working on. And yeah, I feel like it has helped me actually to read the book and to understand other contexts where people have had these challenges and how they dealt with it.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, this notion of a safe space and it's just reminding me, I think for me, some of the biggest challenges are the ones that are when I'm in a disagreement with ideology or viewpoints, are the ones that are a bit more subtle. So, you know, teaching in an anti-oppression course, when I work with white students who are like, oh, I'm not racist, I get it, like I've done all this, you know, like I mean, no, it's a thing. I mean, it happens all the time. And yeah, and you know, it reminds me of when Dr. Martin Luther King said that the biggest threat in the US is the white liberal and not the Ku Klux Klan, because you know what you're going to get with the person in the Ku Klux Klan, but the person who talks about colorblindness. And so that's something that really resonates with me in my role, my identities, where I sit, and my positionality is working with folks who think they got it.
Mm.
I mean, and what is getting it? But yeah, that's something that that's there for me. I love my colleagues quite a bit. And I think we want to hear from you all too. So we want to see if folks have questions. If you do, please feel super free to come up and ask your question in that microphone. If that feels too overwhelming, you can raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you. If there's any sort of thoughts, questions, areas of critique, or just where you're at that you want to bring into this space, we'd really love to hear it. Oh, okay. Here, up there's a. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Jasmine. I'm really enjoying the conversation. And just picking up on the last bit of the conversation when we're talking about safety and the idea of these systems and institutions of power. That last point that you made on people who think they got it. I'm curious how our society is arranged. You know, have decision makers, right? We have academics and thinkers and influencers, right? Who help shape some of the direction. What is the role of academia in perhaps stepping off that ivory tower, in bringing in people with lived experience and folks who are active on the ground at the front lines? How does that part work to influence not just policy recommendations, but the actual decision making from those in power who are able to resource and funnel and put and or force people to do the thing that they want to do?
That's a really powerful and excellent question. And I can always talk. So if others want to take that on.
I think researchers have been using lived experiences for their own benefit, for their own career. This idea of, let me see what people go through, and then I'll analyze it, I'll make sense of it. I think it's problematic. But I think also, although we have as researchers to learn when we are engaging with people with lived experience to produce knowledge that is useful for their struggle. It's very different. But from a more academic perspective, I think that, or at least what I'm struggling with right now, where I'm heading towards is not so much describing the oppression. I think that is not really that useful. I think it is describing the systems. So instead of turning towards lived experience, which exploits, which uses that sort of focuses again on the suffering, right? And gets people to talk about the suffering. We know the suffering. We don't need to know more about the suffering. We need to know what are the mechanisms that create that suffering. So we have to look at power, and power doesn't want to be looked at. It rather as focus on lived experience. But and I'm not, please, I'm not minimizing the importance of lived experience. But then when we're working in terms of lived experience, we should be at the service of. So that's what I would say.
I just want to say add one thing, but I'm not sure if it's what you were speaking about or questioning, but I think a part of it came out when we were editing the book, and we had invited different practitioners, people on the front line, artists, to contribute chapters, and many of them wanted to and couldn't find the time. Like their work doesn't prioritize, they don't get the hours to put into publishing a chapter, for example. And so I think that also has something to do with it, is that if you can be community led, if you can be allied, if you can help support, in whatever way that people who cannot have the time, who are not paid to write the policy papers, if that helps in their own work, if you could be of support, then I think, just like in the book, in a small way, that is something that we can do, because that is a part of our job description. Like we do get paid for that. And so we have that space and time to support in those ways if that's useful. I mean, only if it's useful, really.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine, for the question. And just picking up on what Lara said, I think that universities are very well resourced. And so I personally have now started to almost exclusively do projects that community organizations come to me with. Like, because I think that we have, structures in place, funding, methodology, ways to be able to do the research that people want, to be able to make, the recommendations to government that need these evidence-based policies, whether or not they actually are based on evidence is maybe a different question. I also think, because you also work on migration issues, to Neil's point, sometimes it's very helpful to have the Canadian-born white person go, not because we're speaking for or on behalf, but because the space is such that it privileges certain, like for example, in parliamentary processes that are based on people having citizenship, that can be a place for us to be an ally and to amplify some of the, not just experiences, but actually the demands from our civil society partners. And finally, I would also say, academia, I mean, we're so privileged because we get to teach ordinary people who go out into the world and do all these wonderful things. So I think that's another mechanism for us to bring the lived experience into the classroom through experiential learning, through, and again, it has to be resourced, that you don't just invite people without it being part of, the But I think this is another way in which we can actually change the conversation, because like I teach literally hundreds of students every single year, right? So that can have an impact over time.
I really appreciate the responses quite a bit. And I think my approach to response to that is a little more pessimistic. And I wish that I had the hope that Shayna was talking about earlier, but the ways I see it is that my university was built by enslaved Africans, and I think that foundation is still very much what runs the university in the sense that it's neoliberal, corporate, and capitalistic, and I don't think that fundamentally, I don't see that shifting unless people like me are actually ready to make changes. And what that looks like is by people like me walking out and just deciding to do something different. But I think there's too many people like me in the university who can talk this big game about, you know, reading Audre Lorde or, you know, but speaking of Audre Lorde, like the master's tools will never, you know, dismantle the master's house. And it's like, because we, people like me, are not sort of partnering with groups that are really facing significant subjugation. And I can still keep an arm's length, right? Because I can stand up there and critique the academy, yet I'm still publishing books and doing all that I can to be a part of the academy. And so it's very, very, very complex. And then it's sort of, okay, then there's the whole DEI industry where it's like, oh, if we get a few people of color to do this and that, and we tokenize this and that, but the people up top, the ones in the power, are not actually interested in creating change. And so I think it's sort of this societal, a bigger societal shift that I just don't think folks are ready for. Or maybe they are, but I haven't seen it yet. And I think it's people like me, my responsibility to really help foster that. Do we have time for more? Or, oh,
Can I just add something?
Please.
And just as another strategy, I've read the work of Max Liboiron, and what they say is what they're engaging in within anti-colonial research is to divert funds. So the idea of, okay, we're getting all this money, right? But let's redistribute it properly, or so maybe in the meantime, that might be something of if the money's coming in, let's not refuse the money, but send it where it needs to be sent instead of for, you know. Of course, sorry.
So I don't work or really exist in the academy broadly. I'm a master's student, for clarity. So I can't answer the meat of this question, but I am a member of a handful of marginalized communities. I have some disabilities, I'm queer, and I work in a federal educational institution, is how I'll phrase that. And can't quite just say it here. But what I will say is, I think having active people who hold power, redirecting funds, being mindful, teaching people, priming people to be ready for those changes matters. But I think if you find yourself in a position of power and you aren't ready to make those changes, but you recognize that it's a problem, something that I've seen in my own workplace, yeah, people who are fighting, but people who get out of the way, like don't stand in front of people making change. And if you can enable change, do that. But if you can't, don't be part of the problem. And this sucks, what I'm about to say, but we do still live in that neoliberal capitalist society. I and my peers who have made human rights changes internally, unfortunately, found it very useful to like build the cycle of the business case. As positive change happens below, things get better, that filters up, or vice versa. And if you have allies throughout your institutions, if you have allies in the policymaking positions, if you have people who are willing to get out of your way, incremental change at least can happen. And will that change the entire system? Absolutely not. Does the system need to be changed? Yeah, probably. Will that at least reduce harm for the marginalized people who exist in the system? Yes, and that can't be discounted, the material impacts on those people's lives, because we do want to think about the future, but we also have to think for all the people who exist right now who are suffering and who could use the break.
If you're interested in a little bit of what Nick has been talking about, there's this concept of reformist reform and non-reformist reform. So engaging in those transformations, but ensuring that when you're improving things, you're not improving the system. So the idea of non-reformist reforms can be something that we can work towards while we work towards abolition.
I had something to say, but it was said, so I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, please.
My name is Damo, and my question is like, you talked about like how certain people will say like we get it all, but like what do you think of it when it's come from academia or a scholar that says we get it all, but like they're coming from in the first place that's they have no lived experience to it. So just in that bites.
Thank you so much for the question. I think it speaks to this notion of expert that we were talking about. Who wants to go?
Hey, Damo. I'm going to answer with a question, with a story, okay? I'm not Roma. I've done a lot of work with Roma. I speak Romani, but I'm not Roma. I was in Macedonia doing work with communities, doing work that they were asking to be done. And then somehow I found myself on this list that said that I was a Roma expert, and I freaked out. I was 25 years old. At the time, I only had a US passport. I have two now, okay? Dual citizen, yay, Canada. Bad colonialism, bad genocide. You know, at the time I had a US passport. It was the height of Bush. It was the height of 9/11. It was Patriot Act. It was Guantanamo Bay. It was Abu Ghraib. And it was interesting because I found myself on this list that said that I was a Roma expert. Why? Because English is my first language. Why? Because I went to a fancy schmancy university for graduate school. Why? Because I could also speak the oppressed language, right? So I had that access, right? That word expert actually, and finding myself on that list is what changed my academic and professional life. I actually left the Balkans, came back to the United States and said, I got to work on some things at home. My own home is burning. My own home, in the name of liberty, is subjugating human rights. My own home, in the name of safety, is torturing people. I can be an expert over there and live large and have a really good salary. I mean, I would have been an international, it would have been beautiful, you know? But I don't think I could have slept well at night. And for years, I was like, well, that was the dumbest mistake I ever made, because it caused a lot of professional turns and twists. And I mean, nobody can make sense of my CV, my resume, et cetera, et cetera. But it was because I could not wear that word expert. I had to get out of the way. But I had to take what I learned from having been over there and bring it to try and repair at a place that I felt like I had a place to do it and a responsibility to do it. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think we have to just let go of the word expert. right? We don't know shit. I'm sorry. Nobody, like it's so, right? We dupe ourselves and believing that we understand something, that we've managed to master something when we don't. And it's this sort of real, this sort of fascination with being the top, right? Being the best, being the one, being and of really dominating something, right? The mastery over a topic that is problematic, and that it closes all the doors. Because the moment that we are experts, then we don't have to ask any more questions. We don't have to listen to anybody else, right? The idea of the expertise itself means that there is an answer, that there is a way of doing or of thinking. And that in and of itself, it's problematic.
Question of conclusion.
Yeah.
Do you want to read your response?
Or do you just want
Lara?
a question?
No, I just wanted to read the question, because I think we all, like, I think that's part of also the work, right? And the conversations we have is, whom do you see as an expert regarding the doing of human rights? What about the ethics of human rights? Whom do you consult? To whom, if anyone, do you defer? And yeah, mostly I think it's really about that. That is part of the violence, to be deemed an expert, and who is deemed an expert and what flows from there.
But the academia loves expertise and experts, right? I don't know.
As both a student and an educator, what I've come to learn is the notion of expertise. I will highlight myself as a specialist professionally sometimes in different subject areas. Even the notion of being an expert is to me, a site of colonial violence. It depersonalizes information. It tries to objectify information. It tries to remove it from its context and its relations to people and experiences. And as someone who is adjacent to the academy in a lot of ways, I think that it is my ethical responsibility to work on myself internally, to recognize that though I may present information objectively for the purposes of my job and to get my degree and write my thesis and all these things, I need to make sure that I never think of knowledge as objective, and I never think of it as divorced from its source or those who produced it, because part of the goal of knowledge is also for it to be able to be recontextualized over time and reapplied in different circumstances. And if we make of knowledge an object, then we remove its agency in doing so. And I think the academy thrives on doing that to knowledge.
I'm gonna say but. There are times where having power, having privilege means that things can be heard. There are times where the same thing can be said, but who says it may open up different doors. I think, and I mean, I recently left the academy for many reasons, of which that is not this topic, but our relationship, sometimes when we are consulted because of expertise, what we can do is say, I don't know, but this person might. I don't know, but perhaps if you go here, or we can also say, I don't think that's a good idea. And that's actually what some of the most powerful thing is no, I actually don't think we should do that.
Happens a lot.
Yeah. And so it's the flip side of gatekeeping, right? Like sometimes we think gatekeeping is closing the door, but I think also it's sometimes gatekeeping can be opening the door or pointing towards other doors. And it's something that, it's that real uncomfortable relationship with privilege. And a lot of these chapters have to do with privilege in a lot of ways. And what I often say is I can't apologize for who I am. I can't be anyone else than who I am, but I can recognize who I am. The danger comes when I don't, right? And one of the things that I could do is be like, I'm not the right one, but maybe that person is. Yeah, just want to say that.
Whew. Thank you all so much. We've literally been having these conversations for 3 years. 4 years. And we have an hour to do it tonight. So that was supposed to be funny, but anyway, I just feel really blessed to be here to spend this evening with you all. We haven't seen each other in a while. And thank you so much for the participation and the questions.
Thank you,
And
McNally.
we're gonna have more, yeah, McNally's, they're coming to talk at the end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I just, if I
messy ethics, messy.
So unplanned, but we've had these conversations. This is not the book, okay? What I'm trying to say is that you will not find these conversations in the book because we're each writing based on, and the idea is that when you read, raises these questions. These are questions that come out of when you've read the book. These chapters are dealing with these questions in depth, right? But they're not verbally addressing them that way. Am I making sense?
And the book is 13 distinct contributions. So 13 distinct contributions, some of them ours, Nick, Claudine. There's a poem hanging out right over there that's also in the book. Speaking back to Joseph Conrad. So that's what the actual book is. The conclusion is the introduction of a conversation and an invitation to conversation.
Yeah, so we want you to talk after.
I think we're ready to wrap up, and is someone gonna close us out?
As I peek out nervously. Yes, indeed, that was such a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for sharing here tonight and for bringing this book to us this evening. And thank you all for your attention and for your questions as well. It's been a real privilege just to be able to sit back and listen amidst running sound sliders up and down. I'm also coming in with a nakedly capitalist announcement regarding book purchase procedure. So I do apologize for that. But we do have books over here. There won't be a formal signing this evening because of the number of contributors, but please do feel free to snag a copy of the book and either pay for it at the cash desk or visit one of our contributors or one of the editors and have them sign a copy of the book if you'd like. Feel free to do so very informally. Just please do remember to pay for the book before you visit it. We are so very grateful to UBC Press for helping to make this evening a possibility, and I will reiterate the gratitude mentioned at the beginning of the event for Pauline Tennant and all at the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. Thank you so very much for approaching us to host this event. We're thrilled that we could, and thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful evening.